What do you think of when you hear the word fairies? Do you think of adorable, innocent, fun-loving creatures dancing around flowers? Well, you're wrong. Completely wrong, according to Irish mythology. They're generally said to be less Tinkerbell and more take your wife, take your children, kill your livestock, and curse you with an illness. The one sure way to anger the little folk is by disrespecting them, their powers, or their home. There are said to be a few places where the fairy world meets ours. One such place is fairy rings, also known as fairy forts. These are circles of trees. Another is solitary hawthorn trees, known locally as fairy trees. You will normally see these on the mountainside or in the middle of a field. Locals to this day will still warn you not to disturb them. The Irish fairies are said to have a darker side than some of their European comrades, being quick to anger, mischievous, and casting curses on anyone foolish enough to cross them. And one of the darkest and most terrifying stories involving the little folk is that of the Changeling. Imagine a sickly and irritable baby who never stops crying, with an insatiable hunger, or a baby who struggles to show normal emotions. Or imagine a small child who appears to be wise beyond their years. The very essence of a changeling is that it was almost, but not quite, human. A shadow of what a real child should be. Why did fairies make these swaps? The reasons were many. Sometimes they craved the beauty, vitality, or innocence of a human child. Other times it was a form of punishment for neglectful parents. There's a belief that human babies were kidnapped in order to bolster the fairy stock, as the fairies themselves were said to struggle to produce their own offspring. What did they leave in the baby's place? Elderly or sick fairies. The idea was that human parents would nurse these ill fairies until their deaths. And thanks to their magical powers, these changelings could almost perfectly mimic the baby that they had replaced. It's important to remember that it's not only babies who would be the target of fairy kidnappings. It's said that artists and musicians were especially susceptible to being taken by the fairies in order to provide them with entertainment in their own realm. Back in the day, people had all sorts of ways to protect their children from being snatched by the fairies. It sounds strange now, but they really believed in these methods. For instance, they'd lay fireplace tongs across the cradle. Apparently fairies are terrified of anything made of iron. And placing red garments over or on the crib. Apparently that was a big one. Red clothing was a perfect deterrent because it reminded the fairies of fate and Judgment Day, two things that terrified them. They'd also hang crucifixes over the crib and sprinkle the baby with holy water in an attempt to call on God's protection. It was even said they would sprinkle urine on the little ones, as the fairies would never snatch an unclean baby. But what happens if you're too late? What happens if the fairy has already taken your child and replaced it with a changeling? What do you do? It was said leaving a set of bagpipes anywhere near the crib would entice the changeling out to play them, as they just couldn't resist the opportunity. But it didn't stop there. They had lots of ways into tricking the changeling into exposing itself. One strange method was to cook or brew something in an eggshell over an open fire. This bizarre act would excite and bewilder the changeling so much that it would speak, giving itself away in the process. If these methods failed in exposing the changeling, families found themselves forced to adopt harsher methods. One option was to threaten the changeling's well-being by exposing it to intense heat, or by submerging it in water, or by leaving it outside the home facing the cold of night. It was thought that the fairies, protective of their own kind, would return the human child to prevent any harm coming to the changeling. A less attractive option for the parents was to look after the changeling, knowing that it would wither and die within a short time. But when the parents lost all hope, that's when the really drastic measures took place. Parents who couldn't bring themselves to raise the changeling thought that they could rid themselves of it by burning. This could mean burning the changeling on an open fire, or by putting it in an oven, or even by lifting the changeling on a red hot shovel and leaving it outside on the manure heap. It's said that many parents took the option of poisoning the changeling with foxglove tea, a poison that affects the heart. Can you imagine the desperation, the fear, the lengths these parents would go to that drove people to such extreme measures? Today we have a much greater understanding of birth defects, mental health conditions, and sudden illnesses. But you must remember that the idea of changelings was not fictional to these people. As a result of their false beliefs, many innocent babies, children and adults lost their lives in the worst imaginable ways. Two of which were Michael Leahy and Bridget Cleary. In the mist-shrouded valleys of 19th century County Kerry, Ireland, nestled by the River Flesk, a haunting tale unfolded. Anne Roche, a woman with faith in the old ways, a woman said to have a gift, found herself confronted with a serious situation. Young Michael Leahy, a boy of 4 years old, was afflicted by a sudden illness, leaving him unable to speak and unable to stand. In the whispers of the village, fear stirred that Michael had been replaced with a changeling. Desperate to reclaim the true Michael, Anne turned to the remedies of folklore. With a feeling of hope, Anne ordered 2 men to take young Michael down to the River Flesk once a day for 3 days to submerge him in the icy water. Each immersion was a desperate attempt to force the changeling to flee and for the fairies to return young Michael. They submerged young Michael in the river on day 1, again on day 2, but on day 3 tragedy struck. Michael, frail and vulnerable, on that 3rd day was held under the water for just a moment too long. He died in the icy cold current. The village, already steeped in superstition and whispers of fairy mischief, now buzzed with grief and accusation. Anne Roche, driven by her unwavering belief in tales of old, stood accused of the worst crime imaginable, the murder of a child. It was said that when the police confronted Anne, she had told them that the boy had been taken by the fairies 4 years earlier, indicating that she believed he had been taken at birth. Despite the tragedy that unfolded, despite the boy being lost to the waters, the jury returned a shocking verdict. Anne Roche was acquitted of murder. Her acquittal was not a mere legal formality. It showed the enduring power of superstition and folklore in the hearts and minds of the people of that time. Our second tragic tale takes us to the village of Ballivadley, County Tipperary, in the year 1895. Bridget Cleary was no ordinary woman. She was strong-minded, independent, and quite modern for her time. A dressmaker with a keen mind and a determination to make her own way in the world. She was married to Michael Cleary, a barrel maker, and by all accounts they lived a normal, unremarkable life. The couple were relatively wealthy and lived in a stone cottage with glass windows, while others in the village lived in less modern, mud-walled homes. But in March of that year, everything changed. Bridget fell ill with what we now understand to have been bronchitis or pneumonia. Yet, as we already know, in 19th century Ireland, medical knowledge was often overshadowed with superstition and folklore. As Bridget's condition worsened, whispers began to circulate. Some believed that she had been taken by the fairies and the ailing woman lying in her bed was a changeling. This belief came in part because it was said that their stone cottage was built on an ancient fairy ring. Michael, gripped by fear, desperation and superstition, became infatuated with the idea. Over the course of several days, Michael, Bridget's own father, and several others attempted to cure her using brutal folklore remedies. They forced her to consume bitter concoctions, chanted prayers, and performed rituals. The intention was to drive the changeling out and have his wife returned to him. Bridget, frail and terrified, insisted she was not a changeling. Despite Michael's accusations, she cried out that she was his wife. But Michael's mind was clouded. He was afraid of losing his wife to the fairies forever. On the night of March 15th, a horrific climax unfolded. After threatening to burn her, it was said that Bridget told Michael that the only one away with the fairies was his mother. In a state of frenzied delusion, Michael doused Bridget in kerosene before setting her on fire. He believed that this desperate act would finally force the changeling to flee, returning his wife to him. The flames did their terrible work, but of course, no changeling emerged. Only the anguished screams of a woman betrayed by those she loved. A woman as human as you or I. Bridget Cleary was dead, and with her death, the illusion was shattered. The people who participated in or witnessed what happened were left to face the stark reality of their actions. After one of the witnesses confessed what had happened to the local priest, the police began their search. Not far from her family home, Bridget's burned body was found in a shallow grave. Michael was arrested and stood trial. The world was shocked by the details that were uncovered. Interestingly, Michael Cleary was convicted of manslaughter and not murder. This might be seen as a reflection of the superstitious beliefs held by those in the jury, or possibly even the judge himself. He was sentenced to 20 years, but only served 15. The stories of Michael Leahy and Bridget Cleary endure as cautionary tales. It is a stark reminder of how fear and superstition can warp the human mind, leading to unimaginable acts of cruelty.